The Past as Present, Ayesha Jalal. A top columnist in a leading American newspaper recently described Pakistan as paranoid dystopian, a state that suspects every US move as designed to weaken Pakistan for the benefit of a secret US alliance with India. Paranoia is a mental condition based on delusions of persecution, excessive jealousy, and an exaggerated sense of self. Are Pakistanis paranoid, or is Pakistan paranoid dystopian? A partial answer might seem to lie in the common perception of Pakistan as the world's largest assembly line of terrorists, a product of its compulsive uses of Islam as an instrument of domestic and foreign policy. The botched up bombing attempt of New York's Times Square by a Pakistani-born American has strengthened international opinion that, while all Pakistanis are not terrorists, most acts of terrorism in the contemporary world inexorably carry the Pakistani paw print. Perceptions matter, but devoid of historical grounding can fall short of providing a balanced perspective. Grasping the reasons for the Pakistani tendency for paranoia and violence requires assessing its troubling past in the light of a troubled past. Only then it is plausible to ask how, if at all, Pakistanis can be persuaded to change course, not only in a strategic sense, but also in terms of recasting the rational and emotional framework through which they perceive the world and in turn are perceived by it. Ideological fissures. Billed as the epicenter of global terror, Pakistan has been in the grip of an unrelenting terrorist campaign by elements often supported by states' own intelligence agencies to conduct jihad in Afghanistan and Indian-occupied Kashmir. Over the past 6 years or so, an estimate 22,110 people have been killed, including at least 2,637 security personnel, 7,004 civilians, 5,960 terrorists or insurgents. While Pakistan has become a veritable killing field, its commitment to American-led war against Al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan is under acute suspicion. Why does Pakistan elicit such skepticism and distrust? With the specter of Talibanization radiating out of the northwestern federally administrated tribal areas, FATA, Pakistanis are split on two merits of the strategic alliance with the United States of America. Heated debate on how best to tackle the insurgency in FATA at the University of Peshawar ended in pandemonium when the former chief of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI) Chief General retired Asad Durrani blurted out, "Leave all this discussion. Let me ask the audience. They want the Taliban to win or the US? Just raise your hand." The question underlies the deep ideological fissures inside Pakistan that has made it such a difficult ally for Washington. Whether in private discussions, public forum, newspapers, or back-to-back talk shows hosted on private television shows, a cross-section of Pakistanis are displaying a penchant for the conspiracy theories over reasoned arguments supported by hard evidence, instead of reporting bare facts and letting people draw their own conclusions. And the media opinion managers, assisted by a string of experts, are burnishing the old narrative of national security with apocalyptic fear, lending credibility to the media's conspirational puffery. Are recurrent intelligence failures to prevent suicide bombings in urban centers in retaliation against military operations in Swat and South Waziristan, and a space of American drone attacks on militant hideouts in northwestern tribal belt neighboring Afghanistan, terrorist attacks in key cities even when claimed by the Pakistani Taliban are ritually blamed. American security agencies such as Blackwater and Dine Coal as strategic revenge for Pakistan's refusal to break off ties with the Afghan Taliban and deliver the ever-elusive Osama bin Laden, besieged by enemies within and without. Television spin doctors, impelled by the state's intelligence agencies, attribute Pakistan's multifaceted problems to the mechanizations of invisible external hands, opposed to historically verifiable causes of internal decline and decay. If India's hegemonic designs are not hindering Pakistan at every step, America and Israel are believed to be hatching plots to break up the world's only Islamic nuclear state. Call it paranoia, denial, or intellectual paralysis. But Pakistan's deeply divided and traumatized people are groping for magical formula to evade collective responsibility for the failure to gel as a nation. Individual voices of reason calling for sober analysis and pragmatic responses to an admittedly difficult situation are drowning in an upsurge of anti-American vitriolic. Seeing Pakistanis' ills as gifts from abroad is not the bane of Islamic extremists alone. Liberal-minded Pakistan are, for patriotic reasons, joining the national chorus condemning American-led conspiracies to destabilize Pakistan. A psychologically introverted national mindset resistant to critical self-reflection tends to be suspicious and paranoid. This is not to say that there are no grounds for harboring suspicions of friends and allies, not to mention enemies, but Pakistanis need to ponder why they have ended up as the world's favorite whipping boy. An informed, open-ended and sustained internal debate that can shed light on the root causes of the present predicament is impossible without some semblance of a shared historical consciousness. Yet, the idea of history as a study of the past through rigorous investigative methods of critical inquiry has suffered from willful neglect in the interest of promoting newfangled ideologies defined by regimes pursuing the politics of self-perpetuation. Instead of history, Pakistanis are given emotive lessons in ideology, along with a compendium of selective facts which, instead of opening up minds, parrot the truth of hastily constructed national myths. While myths are an important dimension of the historical imagination of people, they're meaningful only when they bear a broad resemblance to actual history. Shorn of history, people living in myths are just that, a mythical people whose thoughts and actions lack credibility and substance, a frustrated and depressed people. Despite a well-orchestrated official nationalism, Pakistan, ever since its creation, has been searching for moorings somewhere in the toilet zone between myth and history. Not a novel occurrence in a newly independent state, it has, due to a dysfunctional educational system and a closed media, its recent commercialization notwithstanding, led to the dissemination of some remarkable distortions and mistruths, curbs on freedom of speech during extended periods of military authoritarianism, declining educational standards, and obsessive fear of Indian hegemonic designs has stunted the development of a critical intellectual tradition. Intellectuals have been hounded and muzzled or bribed into subservience. History has been reduced to a jumble of cliches by official hacks expounding improbable versions of Pakistan's much-touted Islamic ideology. The achievements of essentially secular Muslim rule in Hindu India for millennia has been tweaked to assert Islamic superiority, forced to imbibe official truths. The vast majority of literate Pakistanis take comfort in ignorance, skepticism, and most concertingly in a contagion of belief in conspiracy theories, the self-glorification of an imagined past matched by habits of national denial have assumed crisis proportions today when Pakistani's existence is under far more serious threat from fellow Muslims than it was in 1947 from rival non-Muslim communities. Importance of history. Established as a homeland for Indian Muslims, Pakistan has fewer Muslims than in India and Bangladesh. Official Pakistani nationalism ascribes the country's creation to the two-nation theory, according to which Indian Muslims were always a distinct community that had resisted assimilation into the subcontinent's predominantly Hindu culture. The claim is not corroborated by historical facts. Indian Muslims shared a common religious identity but were hardly united in their politics. which were more often defined by class, regional, and ideological affiliations. An absence of unanimity in Muslim politics, not the commonalities of religion, allowed the Indian National Congress to cut the All India Muslim League's demands for Pakistan down to size. Muhammad Ali Jinnah had twice rejected the territorial contours of Pakistan as it emerged, describing them as mutilated, truncated, and moth-eaten. He had wanted a constitutional arrangement that gave Muslims something close to parity at a center re-established on the basis of partnership between two essentially sovereign states. Pakistan, represented Muslim-majority provinces, and Hindustan, representing Hindu-majority provinces. Jinnah's hopes of a renegotiation Indian Union based on confederal or treaty arrangements between Pakistan and Hindustan were dashed by Congress's refusal to share power and British haste to draw the shutters on their Indian empire. So their claim to nationhood was succeeded. Muslims as a nation were divided into two hostile states. The contradiction between the claims of Muslim nationalism and the achievement of a territorial state was never resolved, confounding Pakistan's struggle to define an identity that is both Islamic and national. The importance of history in building a cohesive nation was recognized, but the methods adopted proved inimical for national unity. Celebrating the rich diversity of Pakistan's regional cultures might have made for more judicious narrations of the nation, portraying Pakistan as an Islamic entity distinct from Hindu India. The official scribes of nationalism saw regional identities as threats to the state, using the Islamic bond to justify the suppressing and distinctive linguistic and cultural mores of Pakistan's regional peoples, especially during the prolonged bouts of military dictatorship, has politically divisive effects. Before and after Bangladesh's formation in 1971, official versions of Pakistani history elicited derision and resentment in some regions. Without a credible history, people cannot develop a historical consciousness, much less a national one. By devaluing history for political and ideological reasons, Pakistan has found it difficult to project a national identity that can strike a sympathetic chord with its heterogeneous people. 63 years after independence, Pakistan is trying to define the inner and outer contours of its national identity. The dilemma flows from a stubborn refusal to accept the more awkward truths about the historical circumstances surrounding its birth. Pakistanis are conditioned to think that the country emerged from a religiously inspired separatist movement against Hindu domination in an independent India. This overlooks Congress's solution of India's Muslim problem. Not only were the two main Muslim majority provinces of Punjab and Bengal partitioned, but the Muslim League also denied a share of power at the All India level, an arrangement Jinnah had expected to negotiate in order to safeguard the interest of all Indian Muslims. Glossing over the historically weightier matter of the expulsion of Muslim majority areas from India, the managers of Pakistan harped on fears of reabsorption into Hindu India. While relations between the two neighbors have been strained ever since 1947, particularly over Kashmir, it is arguable whether India wishes to reincorporate the Muslim majority areas and endanger its existing political balance between the communities and regions. The desire to encircle and weaken Pakistan cannot be confused with the objective of undoing partition. The India factor. The Indian bugbear helped turn Pakistan into a security state, but threats to its survival as a foreign independent state invariably emanated from within. The army and the senior civil bureaucracy registered their dominance over the parliament and elected bodies at the provincial and local levels within years of independence. The supremacy of the non-elected institutions survived the tentative experiment in parliamentary democracy during the first decade, controlled politics under military dispensation after 1958, and persisted after Pakistan's dismemberment in 1971. Against the backdrop of central-province tensions, a gagged media, weak political parties, and the organizational limitations of civil society, the emerging structural imbalance within the state has given constitutional legitimacy by a judiciary forced into submission by a presumptuous executive. The result was a centralized state structure, federal in form and unitary in substance, whose military authoritarian character was at odds with the tenor of politics in the regions. These structural asymmetries contributed to a lack of democratic institutions, inadequate mechanisms for public accountability, inequitable distribution of resources, and chronic tensions between the center and provinces. The uneasy symbiosis between a military authoritarian state and the democratic political processes is often traced to the artificial nature of Pakistan and the lack of a neat fit between social identities at the base and yet arbitrary frontiers drawn by the departing colonial masters. Yet India, with greater social diversities, laid the foundations of a constitutional democracy. The crucial difference between the two states that replaced the British Raj cannot be put down to a democracy deficit in the Muslim psyche. Nor can the complex and shifting political dynamics that thwarted Pakistan's dreams for peace and prosperity be blamed wholly on America's cynical exploitation of Pakistan's geostrategic location. A choice was made by the rulers of Pakistan in the face of Washington's effort to charm New Delhi with generous amounts of economic assistance. The country's first finance minister, Ghulam Muhammad, summed up the feeling when he told that Pakistanis felt like a prospective bride who observes her suitor spending very large sums on a mistress, that is India. Faced with unenviable choice of accepting Indian hegemony and joining American-backed security alliances aimed at the containment of communism, the Pakistani leadership opted for the latter. By the mid-1950s, Pakistan had entered the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, C2, and the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO, covering West Asia in return for American military and economic assistance. Hitching his wagons to the Anglo-American bloc dented Pakistan's efforts to project itself as a leader in the Muslim world. During the 1950s, an Arab world rife with anti-imperialist and nationalist trends felt little affinity for a country flaunting its Islamic identity. Pakistan's alliance with West bolstered Nehru's bid to register India as a leader of the non-aligned movement. This served to heighten the Pakistan sense of inferiority vis-a-vis India, forcing an abject reliance on American, whose capitalist-driven consumerism and military prowess was as much as an object of resentment as of awe in the country. Manto's letters. The short story writer Saadat Hasan Manto conveyed the mood of an ordinary Pakistani reduced to silently watching the world's richest and most powerful country arming one of the poorest and weakest to counter the locally bully on the block. My country is poor, but why is it ignorant? Manto asked in the first of the 9 satirical letters to Uncle Sam. The percipient uncle had to know the answer in his heart unless it had been removed by one of America's brilliant surgeons. Manto wondered where America got all its money from to such a show-off. He loved his country, however poor and ignorant, tired of wasting his considerable talents, living a life of penury. Manto feared he might soon kill himself or die a natural death, because if flour sells at the price at which it sells here, only a shame-faced person can compete his ordained time on earth. The stark truth was that we neither know how to live nor how to die. What Pakistanis needed most from US were constitutional experts to help draft a constitution. A nation can do without a national anthem but cannot do without a constitution. This is why, unlike the United States, interesting things happened in Pakistan. Ministers changed every other day. Would-be prophets made outlandish claims. Countrywide disturbances brought no change, and inquiry commissions worked under direction of unnamed higher authorities. Manto liked the idea of an American military pact with Pakistan so long as he got a personal atom bomb to lob at mullahs whose habits of personal hygiene offended him. He was certain that American military aid was to arm the mullahs. Once the gangs of mullahs is armed and the pajamas stitched by American machines in strict conformity with the Sharia, the Soviet would have to shut down shop in Pakistan. As Manto anticipated, American influence marginalized the left and weaken an incipient democracy without substantially improving the lot of toiling masses. Islam was regularly invoked, but religion's role in state affairs was kept in check. Retrospectively constructed arrangements about Islam being deployed as an instrument of foreign policy. The successive governments ever since the emergence of Pakistan are in need of modification. There was a vast difference between utilizing religion for state's internal homogenizing logic or upstaging India as international fora and ideologically driven policy of making Pakistan an ultra-conservative Islamic state committed to waging jihad against and sundry. Campaigns by self-styled religious parties look to carry out a political niche in a state whose creation that they opposed, we fearlessly contested, and the tyranny of the mullah resolutely condemned it for the sake of more realistic foreign policy goals. The Islamic Shift. For all the lip service paid to Islam, Pakistan remained a relatively liberal and moderate Muslim state until the 1970s. The loss of Eastern Wing in 1971 was watershed, with a transformative effect on the Pakistani psyche. Apart from subverting the two-nation theory, humiliating military defeat by India took a hefty toll on national pride. Unaccustomed to learning from history and more comfortable with myths of an imagined past, Pakistanis were susceptible to the Islamic charge that the ruling elite's lack of religiosity had caused the country's disintegration. Secular in its political convictions, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto instead tried reviving national morale by acquiring national capabilities and rebuilding a shattered economy. He redoubled efforts to strengthen ties with Muslim oil-producing countries, especially Iran, Libya, and Saudi Arabia. In February 1974, Pakistan hosted the second summit, the Organization of the Islamic Conference in Lahore. The ceremony of the occasion provided the pretext for Pakistan formally recognizing Bangladesh. Lines of credit were sought from friendly Arabian states, softening the blows of global oil shock for cash-starved Pakistan. The global resurgence of Islam on the back of Arab dollars won the admiration of Pakistan's rising middle classes, who sought to emulate the Saudi variant of Wahhabi Islam. This was the gist to the mill of Islamist parties like Jamaat-e-Islami, who used the Saudi call to excommunicate the heterodox Ahmadi community from the Islamic fold to revive their own long-standing demand. Bhutto's cynical decision in 1974 to concede the expulsionary demand of the religious ideologies to declare Ahmadis as minorities undermined the principle of equal citizenships rights in a modern nation-state. While the consequences of the decision have been far-reaching, the critical change in the role of religion in Pakistan came in the wake of Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. General Ziaul Haq synchronized his so-called Islamization policies with American-backed support for the Afghan resistance movement in 1980s, signaling a departure from earlier regimes that had restricted themselves to periodically appeasing the religious lobby with symbolic displays of Islamic rectitude. Zia, upon becoming the chief of army staff, changed the army's motto to faith, piety and jihad in lieu of unity, faith and discipline coined by Jinnah. Handlers of jihad in the ISI developed a stake in the enterprise once billions of dollars flowed in from the US and Saudi Arabia to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. Afghan rebels and local militants fighting the Soviets were regarded as assets that could help Pakistani army extend its influence in Afghanistan to achieve strategic depth against India. A sprawling state-sponsored jihad industry was cultivated by funding madrasas in the northwest that shared a common Pashtun culture. With over 3 million Afghan refugees who had poured into Pakistan, the blending of Saudi Wahhabism with the neo-Deobandi ideology propagated by these seminaries made for witch's brew of religious bigotry and sectarian hatred. State sponsorship of the Deobandis for strategic purposes upset the sectarian demand upset the sectarian balance in predominantly Barelvi Pakistan. Long before the Taliban reared their heads in the tribal northwest of Pakistan, local rivalries dressed up as disagreements over Islam erupted in pitched battles between militant bands of Sunnis and Shias as well as the Deobandis, Barelvis, and the Ahle Hadith. The surge in sectarian conflict occurred against the backdrop of administrative paralysis, mounting regional grievances, and the systematic corruption aggravated by a parallel arms and drugs economy. Despite elected PPP governments led by Benazir Bhutto, Zia's devoted legatees in the political fraternity stuck to the task of ideologically remapping Pakistan as the outpost of original Islam in Saudi Arabia. An already compromised educational system with only a pre-functionary commitment to research and critical analysis were gradually dismantled. A premium was placed on the displays of piety without stemming the growing rot in social morality. The Soviet defeat in Afghanistan, followed by the collapse of communism, fanned illusions of Islamic grandeur that was harnessed by the ISI to project its preferred view of Pakistan's present and future security concerns. Relations with the US culminated in October 1990. Washington suspended military and economic aid to Pakistan for pursuing its nuclear ambitions. This led to a betrayal after services rendered between 1979 and 1989. Suspicious of India and with Kashmir up in arms after 1989, the Pakistan Army's support of the Taliban in Afghanistan gave a flip to religious militancy a home. India's nuclear tests in 1998 were duly matched by Pakistan, encouraging the Army's high command to check New Delhi's resolve by occupying the Kargil heights, making the Kashmir dispute more intraceable than ever. Post 9/11 challenge. This is where the matter stood when Pakistan was catapulted on the center stage with the events of September 11, 2001. While agreeing to support the US campaign against Al-Qaeda operatives, General Pervez Musharraf refused to abandon the time-honored security paradigm of defense against India at all costs. The doctrine of strategic depth was predicted on denying India a foothold in Afghanistan, a prospect whose likelihood increased with the dismantling of the Taliban regime. Like most liberal Pakistanis, Musharraf understood that the world had zero tolerance for a country promoting extremism as an instrument of foreign policy. Yet elements in Pakistan's premier spy agency, the ISI, rejected the need for a paradigm shift in their strategic doctrine. They pointed to India's eager embrace of Hamid Karzai's government, warning that America would quit Afghanistan sooner rather than later. While delivering Arab members of Al-Qaeda to the Americans, the ISI continued support the Afghan Taliban through a clandestine network of retired officers from the army and frontier constabulary. In addition to helping resettle them in Fatah, these rogue ISI operatives built a command and control structure for the Taliban in Balochistan, from where they launched the attacks on America and NATO forces in southern Afghanistan. Fatah's emergence as terrorism central injected a new strain into the equation, strengthening American and NATO forces in Afghanistan as well as Pakistan. After the crackdown of the Lal Masjid in Islamabad in the summer of 2007, a fulcrum of ISI-supported militants since the 80s, a spate of suicide bombings orchestrated by Pakistan Tehreek-e-Taliban targeted the army and police personnel as well as politicians, as fighters from Central Asia, Western China, Turkey, and various Arab countries combined with radicalized Pakhtun tribesmen to train a new generation of Pakistani and European Muslim militants. Al-Qaeda resurfaced in the tribal redoubts of northwestern Pakistan with a vengeance. The ongoing military operations in Fatah have given cause for cautious optimism, but the Pakistani army's reluctance to give up on Afghan Taliban signifies its clash of interest with America in Afghanistan. Is a turnout possible? Pakistan cannot change course without neutralizing or satisfying the security concern of its all-powerful army. So is there a realistic hope for a turnabout? The international community led by the USA and including the European Union, NATO and the UN has to urgently tackle the problems facing Pakistan and Afghanistan in a holistic fashion. This entails assisting Pakistan's civilian government to sort out its political and economic difficulties and weaning the army away from its deadly gamble with religious extremism. Peace will remain a forlorn hope as long as Pakistan and India continue to see their interest in Afghanistan as a zero-sum game. The two nuclear states have to appreciate the threat. A war-torn Afghanistan and unstable northwestern tribal areas in Pakistan pose to the future of the subcontinent as a whole. Washington too has to realize that the policy of dehyphenating relations with India and Pakistan has its limitation, and what is considered an opportunity in one may be the cause of the problem in the other. The idea of the two arch rivals sharing an interconnected future will raise the hackles of those used to viewing the past and the present through the refracting prism of ideology rather than history. Cooperating, not subverting, neighbors can be a more effective way for nation states to re-establish control over rebellious regional satraps. An understanding between Rajiv Gandhi and Benazir Bhutto in the late 80s took the stink out of the Sikh uprising in the Indian Punjab that had been aided and abetted by the ISI, in marked contrast in the resolved issue of Kashmir, which New Delhi impetuous to Pakistan's backing for the popular insurgency in the valley and support for cross-border terrorism. In the moral one-upmanship characteristic of their relations, Islamabad regularly accuses India of sponsoring acts of sabotage in Pakistani cities and more recently of fomenting dissent in Balochistan. The air of mutual distrust suffocating creative thinking in the Indian and Pakistani capitals has kept Kashmir on the boil. This has been detrimental not only for Kashmiris but also for Indo-Pakistan trade relations that are widely believed to hold benefits for both countries at a time of crisis in global economy. The Kashmir conflict has given Pakistani's military establishment excuse for not abandoning its Afghan policy. Once America attacked Iraq and lowered its threat perception from Afghanistan, Pakistani intelligence hawks conceived Musharraf and his top generals that their self-interest demanded keeping lines open with the Taliban and reviving contacts with some of the ISI former wards among the Afghan warlords. Accused by Americans of duplicity and not doing enough, the army leadership has pointed to India's heightened presence in Afghanistan, which rejects the Durand Line as its official border with Afghanistan and claims NWFP and parts of Balochistan. From a military perspective, letting India use its influence over Kabul to squeeze Pakistan from both the eastern and western fronts is suicidal and the reason why the army top brass has resisted US dictation in Afghanistan. The contours of Pakistan's Indian-centered strategic doctrines were etched soon after independence by a civilian leadership, which instead of addressing domestic political problems made the acquisition of Kashmir a national cause celebre. With the army's rise of dominance in the state, the legacy of inconclusive Indo-Pakistan wars over Kashmir and psychologically bruising defeat of 1971, no elected civilian government has been permitted to alter the time-honored security paradigm, despite an ostensibly free press. Out-of-the-box discussions of strategic security are deemed anti-national. For the few, we have questioned Pakistan's defense doctrine. Many more take the path of least resistance by accepting the army's claim that Indians, not the Taliban, are the main enemy. Benazir Bhutto's assassination on 27th December 2009 removed one politician publicly committed to fighting militancy as Pakistan's own war. After the 2008 elections, the PPP-led government took political ownership of military operations against the insurgent hubs in Fatah and settled areas in northwest. Jamaat-e-Islami and other opposition parties accused the governments of waging war on its own people to satisfy its American paymasters, mounting civilian casualties and the displacement of several hundreds of thousands of people have stirred popular anger. especially as the war is showing no signs of coming to an end any soon. The growing American presence in Afghanistan is a matter of great concern, as it is generally believed to be a prelude to a thrust into Pakistan and depriving of its nuclear arsenal. The irony of needing to safeguard nuclear weapons instead of being projected by them is lost on Pakistanis. Pious hymns about national sovereignty run counter to the political and military leadership eagerness for American financial and military assistance. In the absence of a well developed critical tradition and an atmosphere for open dialogue and discourse, a testament to years of military dictatorship and the staggering infirmities of the national education system, the reality deficit in Pakistan is unlikely to take a self corrective course in the foreseeable future. The situation in Fata is grave enough to cause concern in all the neighboring countries. India, in particular, needs to calculate the risks of Pakistan being overturned by unruly tribesmen or collapsing under the increasing weight of its own internal contradictions. In wanting to extract maximum advantages for the new partnerships with India, the Americans do need to calibrate the dangers of treating Pakistanis' strategic concerns with nonchalance and pretending they can win the Afghanistan war on their own terms. Ultimately, Pakistanis have to take control of their own destiny by revising the premises of a national security paradigm that has eroded the basis of their state and derailed attempts at establishing a viable democratic system. Of the manifold challenges facing Pakistan, by far the most formidable is the need to educate the citizenry so that it can engage in an informed debate on how the country's foreign and defense policies can be squared with the requirements of internal political stability. Far from providing the proverbial glue, instrumentalists has created extreme divisiveness and widespread social corrosion. If the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan is targeting Islamabad, radicalized elements in non-Punjabi provinces are talking secession or evoking the Muslim League's 1940 resolution with its confederal overtones to demand sovereignty. Conclusion. Insofar as nations are imagined communities, they are limited and sovereign. The constructed myths of Pakistani past cannot withstand the embedded divisions and tensions of the present. Instead of chasing mirages on a murky and receding horizon, Pakistan will be better served if they are taught how to delve into depths of their own history with the kind of open-mindedness and spirit of free-thinking inquiry which is the basis of mature understanding. It is only then can this troubled and troubling country of more than 170 million begin shedding its curious penchant for myths, delusions, and conspiracies day in and day out of season. Critical awareness of Pakistan's present problems in light of history can overcome the reality defined and help create the political will that can allow Pakistan to navigate way out of a daunting present and chart a future consistent with the aspiration of its rudderless and long-suffering people.